Welcome to Lesson 3 of the Non-Musician's Intro to Digital Music Composition. Starting from where we left off last time, we're going to focus a little more on theory, because as you might have noticed, this melody is really boring. Like, it couldn't get any less interesting. So, let's dive right in here, crack open this MIDI clip, and have some fun. Quick note, in some music editing programs, changes to one MIDI clip will affect another. Like if I were to, say, just delete part of this, you'll see in Reaper, changes like that do not propagate to other instances. So even though I copied this MIDI clip from this one, they are distinct entities. Go ahead and undo that, and let's get started. As I said in Lesson 1, you generally want to use notes that are in the chord. So we'll crack open the chords just to have them handy. But just because you want to use notes in the chord doesn't mean those are the only notes you can use. The two basic techniques for making a melody more interesting are changing its rhythm, which we'll get into later, and passing tones, which we'll cover first. And passing tones are basically notes between the chord notes. They're usually short, and they typically don't come on a beat. So for example, let me get my playhead over here. To make this first measure more interesting, I might, instead of having it just go A, C, E, I might have it include D very quickly, even though D is not part of an A minor chord. And that right there is already, it adds some character to the chord, but because each beat still resolves with a note that's in the chord, it works out. You generally want to stick to notes that are in the scale for this, and you also generally want to make small jumps. If you make a big leap, like for example, if I were to jump an octave all the way up to the next C, that just is kind of hard to follow and a little bit jarring. And in fact, basically the purpose of passing tones is to avoid situations like that. Like if I wanted to go up to that high C, I would probably use some passing tones, like so. Although that fall back down is, again, kind of jarring. Undoing to get back to this setup here. The notes that you use for your passing tones have a pretty big impact on the mood. One very common jazz technique is what's called chromatic passing tones, which is where you use every note between the two notes, not just notes on the scale. So for example, if I were to move between A and E like that, I'll just throw in that note here because it's a little bit off the scale, so that tends to sound a little bit jazzy. The actual reason behind that is because that's a diminished A minor. Don't worry too much about that right now. Just know that a little bit of dissonance makes things sound interesting. It's something you should experiment with. And so yeah, that's chromatic passing tones. Pretty simple. Makes it a little jazzy, a little interesting. A fairly good technique is to just start with what we have here, going back to the very beginning. This layout of just notes on the chord, and then tweaking those, breaking them up, messing with the rhythm, and adding in notes that are outside the chord but still on the scale, or even a few notes that are off the scale. Because if you can put in notes that are outside of the scale and have it sound good, people will be really impressed. And that's a large part of what separates great composition from good composition, is little touches like that. Touching on rhythm for a moment here. what you want is coming up with a good rhythmic pattern is one of the more difficult parts of writing a melody. Early on, it's really easy to be able to hear a good rhythm, but not really be able to spell it out. Generally, you want to mess with what's called a dotted note, which is basically taking a note and extending it half again. So this right here, this note is basically a dotted note. In sheet music, the note would have a little dot after it, hence the name. And that has a lot more character than just a straight arpeggio with a consistent rhythm. Now, a basic compositional techniques to do something and then do it again, but slightly differently. Perhaps the most famous example would be that one song by Bach that everyone has heard, where it goes like dun 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 dun, dun 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 dun. Same thing, lower pitch, and then you hear that same motive, is the technical term, repeated in different instrument layers in the high strings, in the woodwinds, and it recurs throughout the song, but it's slightly different each time. So, what you can do here is break up this first part like we had it originally, and then break up this part, but instead of having it end the same way, have it drop down rapidly down to A, and move into the next one a little bit. And then you'd probably want to keep the rhythm the same for at least the next part, so that it sounds smooth. And in this part you can get away with leaving this the same because it's just a little bit different, enough that the listener is pleasantly surprised rather than, shocked and awed. Quick note here. Note that what's kept consistent pitch-wise is spacing on the scale. Rather than keep the distance of 2 steps between these notes here and here, instead what's kept constant is the position of 1 note higher on the scale. D being the 4th note moves up 1 to the 5th, B being the 3rd note moves up 1 to the 4th. That, especially when the steps are different but the position on the scale is the same, relatively speaking, is a very good way to write something that sounds interesting and good. It's just kind of it's a safe way to write a melody. It's a safe way to add variety to a melody. Then, for this part, again, you'd probably want to keep this constant. Note that spacing is being kept the same. So that, it's moving from 4th up to 5th, and from 3rd to 4th. So it's just advancing up the scale linearly, even though the difference in terms of pitch is different. Then, for this section, you could... Well, it depends what you're going for. You could keep it the same to call back to this section. You could change it to be more like this part here from the first measure. You could make it a long held section, like this, or something else entirely. Generally, you want measures to end with fast notes. Like, rather than have this hold all the way and then change, you'd probably want it to do a bit of lead in to the next note and have something, say, like that at the end. Probably more like that. So that, well, you can hear the difference. as opposed to it's, you know, not a rule by any stretch of the imagination, but just a general suggestion for keeping the song moving. Because one thing that beginning composers often do is have their measures start with movement and end with a long note. And when every track in your song is doing that, it creates this weird, like, seesaw dynamic where the song will have action, and then peter out, and then action, and then peter out, and it kind of puts your listeners to sleep. So, remind yourself to add variety at the end of measures, and that will definitely go a long way towards making your songs more interesting. Typically, at the end of a measure, you want to do something completely different that leads into the next measure. This is especially important when you're transitioning from, say, verse to chorus, or to solo, or to whatever. Transitioning between bigger sections, rather than just from measure to measure. That said, you still want to have some kind of transition back to the start of a measure if it's looping, or anything like that, and ideally you want to have something like that on all your tracks. So in this case, I'm going to make the Melodies transition very simple. A slow build up here. I'm going to make it like this, so that to the listener's ear, logically, if it continued ascending, the next note would be A, which is the first note of this particular MIDI clip. And that's basically just setting up a simple logical pattern for the listener. It drops, and then it starts ascending, and then it ascends, and then they expect it to continue ascending, and it all works out. Very straightforward transition. Also, as a general rule, and this is actually a rule, the fourth and fifth notes of a scale very cleanly go back to the first note. So, a lot of times your melodies will end, say, in A minor. They would end either on E or D. Those are very common ending points. You can really end your melody on pretty much any note, as long as it sounds good. Trust your ears, don't worry too much about the theory at this point. But know that if you're looking for an end point, aiming for D or E, especially for chord progressions, you will notice our chord progression does in fact end over here on E minor, which resolves very cleanly back to A minor. Anyway. Right. Okay, so the reason I made this simple is because I want to add a transition on another track. Drums, very common. We'll split this into 2 MIDI clips and then add very, very basic drum transition at the end. Double bass, double snare. This is straightforward. Now we'll put a clap at the beginning. So now you have, oops, that's a little too long. Your basic loop of drums, and then at the end of the measure, something slightly different, which just cues the listener in to, hey, something's about to change, you should be expecting new material. The sort of basics of writing popular music, which is basically anything that's not designed to toy with your listener, is to establish something, basically say what you're going to do and then do it. In this case, you say you're going to transition by making a small change, and then that cues your listener in to expect a bigger change. You want to surprise them a bit. So, for example, you could include just, oops, split this clip. You could include just 1 bar of silence here. So after the end of this measure, if you were going to do that, you'd probably want to extend this melody clip here so that this note holds a little longer. There's not really any theory behind that I know of. It's just doesn't totally shock your listener by cutting out everything. It lets them know the song is still going. But at the same time, it's just enough of a pause that it catches their attention and gives them a break from the wall of sound they've been subjected to. On the subject of walls of sound, you do want to include gaps like this in any project. Just vary your number of active tracks throughout the song. All like all the time in music, you hear them like cut, so it's just the like this. This is just the melody and the drums. That's a very common bridge between sections. And works well as a transition also. And yeah, pay attention in songs you like to how they transition between sections, just in terms of adding and removing tracks. It's a very simple technique that doesn't require a lot of knowledge of either composition or production, and it's very effective. So keep an eye out for that one. You can keep an eye out for other techniques that you like as well and just sort of keep them in the back of your head, but at this point you probably won't be able to implement them as well as you'd like to. That's all there is to say on this third lesson, and that should give you a reasonable foundation for making more interesting melodies. Catchy melodies are pretty important. They're a big part of what makes music awesome, and they're also something that takes a lot of practice. There are a few more rules involved that we'll be going into in later lessons, but first and foremost, trust your ears and experiment a lot. Writing melodies is one area where I think having a MIDI keyboard hooked up is really helpful, or just a piano or any other musical instrument. I like a MIDI keyboard because you can wire it into Reaper so that it will play your synths when you hit the keys, and that's good for brainstorming and messing around. I'm not much of a performer myself, and I still find it useful to have. If you don't have any sort of instruments around, that's no big deal. There is an on-screen keyboard in Reaper. If you go to View, Virtual MIDI Keyboard, this will pop up, and you can press various keys on your keyboard and play around with synths. That's all I have to say. So, thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next lesson.